All right, so in section 3.2, we're talking about complex numbers, but before we do that, we're going to start with a similar concept from Algebra 1. We're going to add 3 plus 4x and 2 minus x. When you add 3 plus 4x and 2 minus x, you need to remember that you're just combining like terms. The 3 and the 2, the numbers are like terms, so you add 3 plus 2. You get 5. And then you combine your x terms also, the 4x plus negative x. 4x and negative x is 3x. That's it. You just combine like terms. When you're subtracting, it's a little more complicated. It's worth writing out. Oops. Writing out the right way. You're subtracting the 2x minus 1 from 3 plus 4x, or 2 minus x. So 3 plus 4x, and then it says from that you are subtracting 2 minus x. You got to think of that as being in parentheses. So since there's a negative and then parentheses, you have to distribute. So that's really a minus 2, and a negative times negative is positive x. Then you combine like terms. We have a 3 and a negative 2, that makes 1. And then 4x plus x makes 5x. And then the last one here, C, says multiply. So we're doing 3 plus 4x times 2 minus x. You probably remember this being called FOIL. So when you FOIL, F stands for first. You multiply the first term times the first term. 3 times 2 is 6. O stands for outside. You multiply the outside terms together. 3 times negative x. I stands for inside. 4x times 2, that's 8x. And then L stands for last. 4x times negative x. Positive times negative is negative. 4x times x is 4x squared. And then before any problems ever finish, you always have to check for like terms, see if there's anything you can combine. Combine those two, they're like terms. So you get 6, negative 3 plus 8 is 5x minus 4x squared. So the big idea, the things you have to remember from this that we're going to apply to what we're doing today, when you're adding, you combine like terms. When you're subtracting, you distribute the negative and combine like terms. And when you're multiplying, there's FOIL. First, outside, inside, last. And combine like terms. So from yesterday, we talked about how you can multiply imaginary numbers. We did a lot of squaring imaginary numbers, that sort of stuff. But I squared equals negative 1 is the big idea from that. Whenever you see I squared, you replace it with a negative 1. So you multiply these just like yesterday. 3 times 2, 6, and then I times I is I squared. You multiply your numbers, and then you multiply the i's. And then I squared is -1. So this I squared right here is -1. So that's really like 6 times -1. So it's -6. Number 2, same thing. You multiply your numbers, and then you multiply the i's. -4 times 6 is -24. I times I is I squared. I squared is -1, so that's like -24 times -1 is +24. I squared just changes the sign. That's all it does. -1 just changes the sign. These other two are just trying to make it more difficult. Square roots, you multiply them. They're still numbers. Square root of 3 times square root of 3. You multiply the inside numbers. Square root of 3 times square root of 3 is like square root of 9. I times I is I squared. And then we know that the square root of 9 is 3. I squared is -1, so that's -3. And the only way it gets more difficult is if the numbers are bigger. So, bigger numbers, 54 times 6, inside square roots. It's 324. It was a positive times a negative, so it's a negative. And I times I is I squared. To simplify that square root, and we know that I squared is -1, so that changes a negative to a positive. And the square root of 324 is actually a perfect square. 18 squared is 324, so that's 18. So those are the two skills that you need to be able to do. You need to remember all the stuff about what I squareds do and how to multiply. And you have to know how to combine like terms. That's all there is to this lesson. So we're just going to put it together. So we put it together for this thing called a complex number. You do not need to write all of this down. The main thing you need to know is that a complex number is a plus bi. A plus bi is a complex number. A and b are numbers. So like, we'll see some examples right here. 3 plus 4i, 4 minus 2i. You can have square roots in there. That's okay too. Complex because it mixes real and imaginary. Think about how complex your life would be if your real friends and your imaginary friends mixed together. That would be really complex. That's all it means. Complex. Real and imaginary mixed together. So there's the real part and the imaginary part. It's not a huge deal, but because it's not difficult. The imaginary part is the number with the I, and the real part is the number by itself. So the real part is the number by itself. 3, 4, 1. That's the real part. The imaginary part is the imaginary part with the I. 4i, negative 2i, negative I squared of 5. That's the imaginary part. What makes this easy is when we do all the math with complex numbers, I is just like a variable. You can treat I just like an X. You can combine like terms. You can multiply I times I to get I squared. The only thing that makes it more difficult is if you get an I squared, you're going to change it to a negative 1. That's it. Other than that, it's the same as what we did in the warm-up right here. We're going to add and subtract complex numbers first, and then we'll multiply them. So when you add or subtract complex numbers, you're adding or subtracting the real parts together, because they're like terms, basically. And then you do the imaginary parts together, because they're like terms. So you're going to do the real parts together. Negative 7 plus 5 is negative 2. And then you do the imaginary parts together. 2i plus negative 11i. It's not squared because we're not multiplying. It's just I. You only get I squared when you multiply. That's it. That's kind of it. You're combining like terms. We're going to do the same thing, but this time it's a subtraction, which means we need to distribute the negative sign. So that's negative 2 minus 3i. And then you combine the real parts. 18, negative 2, that's 16. 27i minus 3i, that's 24i. Combine the real parts, combine the imaginary parts. Combine like terms. So when you multiply complex numbers, it's just like when we multiplied in the warm-up. You're going to FOIL. And the only thing that's different is when you do that, at some point you'll get an I squared, and you got to remember I squared is negative 1. So this is where it all comes together. All that stuff we did in the warm-up, those skills we needed. So you start by FOILing. Take first terms, 4 times 6. That's 24. Then you take outside, 4 times negative 2i. That's negative 8i. Then you do the inside, 9i times 6. 9 times 6 is 54. I. And then last, 9i times negative 2i. So 9 times negative 2 is negative 18. I times I is I squared. I squared is negative 1. So this I squared with a negative 18 makes it be positive 18. Changes the sign. You can cross it out and change the sign. And now we need to combine like terms. You combine your real numbers, you combine your imaginary numbers. So combine our real numbers, 24 plus 18. 42. And then you combine your imaginary numbers, -8, +54. -54 minus 8 is 46. That's it. So if you wanted a couple of steps to remind yourself what to do, you're going to FOIL. And then you're going to do change your I squared to -1. And then you combine the real parts, combine the imaginary parts. So FOIL, again, -3 times 7, -21 for your first step. Then you do the outsides. -3 times 4i. Then you do the inside. 12 times 7 is 84. I. And then you do the last. 12 times 4 is 48. I times I is I squared. I squared is -1, so we're going to cross it out and change the sign. Make that be -48. And then you combine the real part, the real numbers. -21 and -48. They're both negative, so it's getting bigger negatives, 60, 69. Then you combine the imaginary parts. -12, +84. Bigger number's positive, so it's +72. I.